Why is it called the Black Death? We did that. Hey, check out Sam, go shake his hand. Hashtag justice for rats, hashtag rats did nothing wrong. Hi, I'm Dr. Eleanor Janega, and I am a medieval historian. And today, I'm here with History Hit answering Google's most popular questions about the Black Death. Helping me is my childhood rat toy, Primrose. Thank you, Primrose. So, without further ado, let's get into it. Okay, first question. What was the Black Death? A wonderful question. Now, the Black Death is very, very specifically an outbreak of the bubonic plague that started in the 14th century in 1338. You can get the bubonic plague at other periods of time, and in fact, it becomes endemic in Afro-Eurasia after this initial outbreak. But if you're talking about those outbreaks of plague, that's not the Black Death. That's just sparkling death. The Black Death has to be the original one from the 14th century. Next question. When was the Black Death? Okay, so linking back to the first part of this, it starts out in 1338 in what is now Kyrgyzstan. And we know this as a result of the fact that a bunch of people died, first off. And second of all, they had graves that specifically gave the date and said that the people there died of plague. So it starts out in Kyrgyzstan, but Kyrgyzstan is a very important place in the medieval world because it's smack dab in the middle of the Silk Roads. So you've got lots of caravans coming through, and the plague is able to spread from the people there who have it onto the caravans and begin moving back and forth east and west. So it begins to make its way slowly into China and into Europe. It gets into Europe about 9 years later. So about 1347, it first happens in Italy. And we think about December 1347 for that. And then by June 1348, it's finally hit England. So it really depends on where you are at the time. You know, in Baghdad, they get the plague at a different time to Kyrgyzstan to London. It all depends on how well connected you are and how far away you are from Kyrgyzstan, basically. Where was the Black Death? The Black Death is an Afro-Eurasian problem. So basically, if you are in Africa, Europe, or Asia, congratulations, you have the Black Death now. No joke. So basically, there's some people who don't get it. So Australasia, they don't have to deal with it, nor do the Americas, though everybody can have the Black Death now, except for Australia. Good for you, Australia. But the Black Death is basically something that happens everywhere. And there's a common misconception that this is something that just happened to Europe, but if you think that, it's because you only speak European languages, basically. So, you know, we have a kind of bias of sources where we tend to read things in our own language, surprise, but there's plenty of stuff written down in Mandarin about how they get the Black Death, tons of stuff in Arabic. Basically, it's possible to get it if you are just circulating. And there's tons of circulation in the 14th century in Afro-Eurasia. People are trading goods all the time, stuff is moving back and forth, and just like now, part of the stuff that moves back and forth is germs, unfortunately. So yeah, if you're in Africa, Europe, or Asia, I'm very, very sorry, but I have some terrible news for you about the Black Death. How many people died of the Black Death? So I can't give you an actual number, but what I can give you is a percentage. And it's 25% of the total population of Earth. That's a lot of people. It's even more people when you consider the fact that, again, Australia and the Americas are not involved in this. So it's only 3 of the populated continents that actually get the Black Death, and 25% of people die. And now there is a kind of ebb and flow to how many people die. You have more people die in more crowded areas. So in places like, for example, Florence in what is now Italy, up to maybe 60 to 70% of the population died, which is massive. It's absolutely bonkers. Similarly, places like Baghdad had really high levels of death. But then, you know, if you are in a village out in the countryside and no one makes their way through, you might get away with it. It might be a little bit less bad. And in fact, we know that there are places in Europe, for example, like the Kingdom of Bohemia, where we think they kind of got the Black Death, but it doesn't kill anyone in anywhere near the numbers as it does in the rest of Europe. Oh, we don't know why. We have absolutely no idea. But it's a huge and brutal thing, you know, to the point where you have entire towns just completely collapse, where there are not enough people left alive to keep it running, so they just wander away. It is a really severe epidemic. And, you know, as people who've just lived through one, think about it being, you know, 20 times worse than that. It's pretty bad. Next question. Where did the Black Death come from? Okay, so the Black Death is a particular bacteria that is called Yersinia pestis. I look very cool when I say that. That's the only bacteria I can tell you the name of. But it is particularly a bacteria that lives in the entrails in fleas. And so we think that these fleas were living in a marmot colony in what is now Kyrgyzstan. But people were bumping up against where the marmots were, and so the fleas kind of transfer onto people or other animals. And then once it kind of gets into you, you can spread it to other people. Now, the fleas are still spreading it. Let's make that clear. If you come get bitten by one of those, that's really, really bad. But also, I'm telling you, you don't want to lick someone with buboes. It's not going to go well for you. Germs exist. So once it gets into people, people can give it to people. It's not just a flea thing. So basically, it comes from Kyrgyzstan, it comes from fleas, it comes from the fact that humans and animals live side by side then as now, and that's how you get this. Next. Who started the Black Death? Fleas? Yes? Next question. Why is it called the Black Death? We did that. This is something that historians had done. So no one at the time called it the Black Death. They tend to call it the pestilence or the plague. So this is something that historians do after the fact. And we call it that just because we think it's pretty dire, innit? So we're using here black as a specific pejorative in terms of like thinking, oh, like everything is so black and dismal. But no one at the time called it that. It's like how no one at the time thought it was the medieval period. No one was like, damn, I'm so a middle-aged person right now. Like that's not what happens. These are terms that we use as historians in order to kind of like separate things out. And it's for me to know if you're talking about the 14th century plague as opposed to, for example, the 17th century plague. So that's something for us. Next question. What are the other names for the Black Death? The plague? The Great Pestilence? That's a really popular one, the Great Pestilence. But it tends to be that when we see documents, especially from Europe at the time, they call it the pestilence. So you can definitely call it all of those things. And if you just call it bubonic plague, which is also the more technical term for it, that's absolutely fine. It's just that you would then have to say the bubonic plague that happened in the 14th century. So if you say the Black Death, it's a really useful shorthand for you so that everyone knows exactly which one you're talking about. If you're thinking of like, the plague doctor guy with the little beaky bird mask, he's not Black Death, he's 17th century plague, right? So you would then have to differentiate. So this is just a little shortcut for you, so go ahead and use it. What did the Black Death look like? Great question. Now, the number one thing about the Black Death and why it's called the bubonic plague is the thing that happens to you is you get what are called buboes. Gross name. And basically what happens with buboes is that your lymph nodes swell up because they're attempting to kind of filter out all the germs, and they become incredibly huge and you can see them under the skin. The poet Boccaccio says that they look kind of like eggs under the skin. And in particular with the Black Death, it's not necessarily the throat. I'm just pointing to my throat because, that's what happens when you get like a sore throat. But oftentimes it's in the armpits or in the groin in particular. So you would get huge swellings there. People are often said to become quite pale and pallid when this happens to them. You generally get a fever and a lot of swelling. And this generally happens within a period of about 4 days from the time that you get it to the time that you actually expire. There are also some variants that say sometimes you would get a rash on your chest or on your face that was kind of red and livid, they often called it. But number one telltale sign that you're dealing with the Black Death is that you've got big gross egg lumps in your groin or your armpits. It's not a very nice way to go, let's just put it that way. Next question. What were the Black Death symptoms? Okay, so buboes, number one, right? Big swellings in your groins and in your armpits. But there is also sometimes fever, often fever. And then we get some weird variants. Because sometimes when medieval people are writing about the Black Death, they will often say that there is also a coughing of blood or constriction of the lungs and an inability to breathe that is often talked about. And we think that's a little bit weird because Yersinia pestis now, when it happens, and it does happen, but it's okay, we've got antibiotics, it's chill. We don't see those symptoms come up. So it might be that you get bubonic plague and then also something else can come in, just sort of like now, if you get sick with one thing, it's really easy to get sick with another. Or maybe Yersinia pestis has kind of changed a little bit over time and that did happen. But general rule of thumb, you're looking for buboes, you're looking for an incredibly high temperature, and basically then dying. That's one of the big symptoms. I don't know what to tell you, man. But yeah, it's basically a big gross mess. Next question. Was the Black Death bubonic or pneumonic? It's very difficult for us to know. Now, see, this relates to the fact that we have these different ways of talking about the plague, because sometimes people would say, this person died of the pestilence, and they don't have buboes at all, according to what is written down. They will have these chest issues. They will have issues with breathing. They will have these rashes. And that has led some of us later to call this the pneumonic plague as opposed to the bubonic plague. Retrospective diagnosis, which is when we look in the past and we try to say you are sick with this, is a really slippery slope and a difficult thing to say. But we do have ways of genetically testing bones to see what diseases were in them when people die. And when we test the bones that we find, for example, in plague pits, we generally find that they had Yersinia pestis, right? So which is the one that we associate with buboes. So maybe at the time there are lung symptoms that come along with it. Maybe people are getting sick with it, or maybe people are just so distressed by the fact that everyone they know and love is dying that they're just like, yeah, man, he couldn't breathe, right? It's very, very difficult to say. And it's also difficult to say because basically medieval people have a really different way of relating to sickness, of relating to disease. And when everyone you know and love is dying, their first instinct isn't like, oh man, I've got to really record the symptoms. I got to get this exactly right because in, 800 years, people are going to want to know if this is bubonic or pneumonic. I'm sorry, I was not their top priority, unfortunately. But basically, it's a really muddled time. People are panicking. It's really horrid. So we don't always have exactly clear accounts of what happened. So it's a little bit of a mystery, but that's okay. It's kind of fun. Next. What was the cure for the Black Death? There wasn't one. Next question. Why was the Black Death so deadly? Great question. Basically because there's no antibiotics. That's it. Even now, if you aren't treated with antibiotics, you will die, right? It's not something that we need to worry about so much. Bubonic plague occurs on every continent, every decade, except for Australia. Pretty good ways of keeping germs out. If you're an island continent, that really, really helps. But we're super good at stopping it now, once we identify that it's happening. So we don't worry about it so much. So medieval people don't have antibiotics. And you know what? That's normal. For the great majority of human history, antibiotics don't really come into play until about the 20th century. Once penicillin is invented, then we're off to the races. But at this point in time, people don't even know about germs. And nobody knew about germs, again, until the 19th century. So the entire world, up until the 1800s, is working off the idea that health is determined by the humors. Now, they know that you can get sick if you're around another sick person. So it's an idea that we call contagion. Right? So they're like, probably not best to let another sick person breathe on you. But they don't know that there are little microscopic guys running around and that that's what makes you sick. So if you don't even know that germs exist, then how can you know that there are going to be antibiotics that are going to kill the germs? I don't know if you were around during COVID, but it's really easy to get diseases sometimes. We know about viruses and germs, right? If you're around other people and everyone is living around each other, yeah, then it's very, very easy to spread disease. So it is a perfect storm of the fact that people don't know what germs are yet and aren't going to know what germs are for another 500 years. People are communal animals, so we pass things on to each other. Was the Black Death contagious? Yeah, brah. Pretty contagious, isn't it? Number one way to get it is fleas. They come bite you, that's going to be bad, but you don't need the flea to bite you in order to get it. If your sister has the bubonic plague and you are sharing a bed with her, super, super common thing for children in the medieval period, odds are you're going to get it too. So, it's not like if someone gets the bubonic plague now, everyone is like, hey, check out Sam, go shake his hand, right? We don't want it moving around that way. The number one way that you get it now is that a flea who has it comes and bites you. But fundamentally, it does kind of escape that particular way of traveling, and it gets through from human to human contact. Next question. How did the Black Death spread so quickly? Well, it kind of did and it didn't. It's a 10-year period from Kyrgyzstan to London, right? So that's rather a long time. But basically what happens is that once we start paying attention on a micro level to various places, it seems like it's spreading quickly, and it does. So, it's moving around in Central Asia and China and places like that for a kind of longer period of time. What it needs to do is get into cities. And the thing about Kyrgyzstan at the time is that there are definitely trading posts and outposts along the way, but you need to go towards like Samarkand and places like that are more in Uzbekistan in order to get to a huge population of people. These are towns, they're not cities. Once it gets into cities, that's the issue, because you need that person-to-person contact. You need this perfect storm of people being around other people who have it. So it kind of does and doesn't. It really all depends on how you look at it. And basically, it just spreads really quickly because it's super, super contagious. I mean, think about how quickly COVID spread. That was way faster than how the Black Death spread. So partially why we think it happens quickly is a phenomenon kind of like collapsing time, is what we sometimes call it within the history world. So looking back, we go, wow, and then within 10 years, this many people were dead. But 10 years is kind of a long time if you're actually living it. But from the perspective of history, it's not. So, this is something that goes on for a number of years and kind of gets worse and worse and worse and worse. It mushrooms. There's one way of looking at it that it's very, very quick, and there's one way of looking at it that it's actually a slow process. It just all depends on your perspective, really. Was the Black Death spread by the Mongol Empire? Okay, well, so calm down, homie. In the first place, what do you mean by the Mongol Empire, right? This is not my boy Temujin, aka Genghis Khan, shout out to a real one, who was doing this, right? There is this idea that part of what moves the Black Death from Central Asia over towards Europe is the Golden Horde, who are one of the Khanates. And that's probably realistic, right? Because you've got a lot of people who are moving from Central Asia over towards the Crimean Peninsula and over towards Europe. And obviously, if you've got that many people moving through with a contagious disease, they're going to take that disease with them. This is kind of referencing what is probably a legend about a guy, Yani Beg, who was at the head of the Golden Horde. And there is a legend that he was sieging a town on the Crimean Peninsula, and what he did was he took bodies and catapulted them into the city and intentionally spread the Black Death. This is probably not true. We have absolutely no evidence, except for a bunch of people who really don't like the Mongols who say this happened. And it would just be a bit weird. In the first place, it's like them using catapults is a bit strange. Like, this is not their modus operandi, usually. And it's a really cool black legend to tell about somebody that you don't really like. So, they get over to the Crimean Peninsula, and we know that people then on the Crimean Peninsula get the Black Death, and then they move from the Crimean Peninsula down into Constantinople and then over into Italy, and we do know that it spreads like that. We cannot say that it was intentionally spread by the Mongols, and it's kind of just like intentional bad PR, right? Was the Black Death spread by rats? Look, the rats did nothing wrong, homie. Leave the rats alone. Gentle rats. It's not their fault. It's not their fault. Were there fleas on the rats that gave people the Black Death? Yes. Now, is it the rat's fault that there are fleas on it? No. It's your fault. Why you got a flea on you right now? Look deep inside your soul. I don't understand why is all this rat hate? Like, why do you have to go directly to the rat? It wasn't a mammal's fault. This is all about fleas. You're adding an extra step. The rats didn't do it. Hashtag justice for rats. Hashtag rats did nothing wrong. Hashtag death to fleas. Yeah, I'm comfortable with that. That's fine. That's fine. Okay, next question. Why did the Black Death start in Weymouth? Well, the Black Death didn't start in Weymouth. It started in Kyrgyzstan, so jot that one down. The Black Death gets into Weymouth, though, because it's a pretty significant port. The fact about England is that it is a place for shipping. Essentially, England in the medieval period is a petrostate, but for wool. So English people are growing really good little sheepies. They are taking wool off and they're sending wool over to the continent. Wool is actually very sexy, all right? Because it's like in a world without central heating, a miracle fiber that stays warm even when it is wet is a really, really big deal. So they're constantly exporting wool from England and importing stuff like whatever, wine, silk, things of this nature, spices, all the good stuff. They're bringing it in. So Weymouth is one of these ports. It is exporting wool and it's importing other things. And so that's how the Black Death gets in there. And it's got pretty good connections to London. And once it gets into London, that's it. Job done. So basically, Weymouth has the Black Death as a result of the fact that it's a shipping town. So it's just about trade, really. Did the Black Death reach Scotland? Yeah, got up in there. We tend to find places that escape the Black Death are pretty few and far between. And even when they do sort of escape it, there's going to be some guys who died there. But yeah, there are definitely deaths of people up in Scotland. It just takes longer for them to reach Scotland. You know, just in the way that it takes longer for it to get to England, it's then longer again for it to get Scotland. So basically, it's just kind of like a process of a tide rising up and up and up and up the island. But yeah, Scottish people got the plague, for sure. Who did the Black Death affect? People. I mean, most people is the answer. There was no real way of getting out of the Black Death a lot of the time. Sometimes people just survived it. It's very few and far between. If you got it, sometimes people come back. Doesn't always happen, but it is possible. And sometimes people just don't get it, and we're not exactly sure why. You know, some people do live through it. But fundamentally, if you're around people who have the Black Death, odds are you are also going to get it. People have a lot of different strategies to kind of like avoid this. So sometimes the rich survive at better levels, because if you have got a big old country estate that you can retreat to and you can stop people from coming in, that is a better way to avoid it, right? So sometimes rich people, they manage to just dodge it. Whole book about this, Boccaccio's Decameron. Check it out. But people in cities are going to have a much harder time because there are people who are coming into trade and they're living much closer together, so both germs and fleas can move from one person to another. So people in cities are more likely to get it, but that doesn't mean that only people in cities get it. It can affect anyone, and we don't really know why it doesn't affect some people. How was the Black Death treated? Was it? I mean, they got some answers for it, right? Like, you know, for the most part, what happens is there will be like herbs that are administered, which is kind of like one of the major forms of medicine at the time. So, you know, you might have some tinctures that are brewed. Oftentimes teas will be made. But one of the big things that happens with the Black Death is that it's so deadly and it happens so quickly that a lot of time physicians are like, yeah, nah. I'd rather not go in there, you know, because you don't want to get it yourself. Again, they understand the idea of contagion. They don't know that it's germs, but they know that if you go up near a sick person, you might get sick. There are some people who kind of try to treat it by keeping a diet so that they don't get it. And there are some evidence there of people being like, well, the Black Death is cold and dry, so I'm going to eat foods that are thought to bring up my warm and wet humors. So having soups and spices and things of this nature. Now, I'm going to be so real with you, that is not going to stop the Black Death. Now we treat Yersinia pestis with antibiotics. Works to treat, does a very, very good job. But, you know, obviously if you don't have antibiotics at the time, it's not going to do anything. So for the most part, if you just tried to make people comfortable, a lot of times you'd be giving painkillers and prayers. And that's kind of what was going down. They kind of know that there isn't really anything they can do about it. And there's a lot of hand-wringing. Physicians are really upset about this. You see them despairing that they can't actually help people or do anything about it. And so this is why there's kind of a religious idea that maybe this is a punishment from God. You know, if there's absolutely nothing that can be done to save people, then maybe it's God's will. People differ on that interpretation. But yeah, there's not a whole lot that anyone could do or that was done. Next question. No more questions. Well, it's very, very difficult to find a place to stop. If you want to hear more from me waffling on, you could check out my podcast, Gone Medieval, on the History Hit Network. And as always, you know, smash subscribe, because usually I'm on here making videos about stuff that I think is interesting.